Right. Good morning, colleagues. The 9,382nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Romania, Turkey and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. 3 member states also expressed interest in participating in today's meeting, namely Estonia, the Netherlands and Poland. They will submit their statements for publication in letters addressed to the President of the Security Council, which we will circulate. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and, as requested by the Russian Federation, Mr. Mikhail Khazin, an independent macroeconomist. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olaf Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Madam President. On Monday, when speaking to this Council, I reiterated the Secretary General's deep regret over the decision by the Russian Federation to terminate its participation in the Black Sea Initiative, including the withdrawal of Russian security guarantees for navigation in the northwestern part of the Black Sea. As a result, food prices are rising around the globe, adding to existing agricultural, energy, and financial crises that are already severely impacting the world's most vulnerable people. We have now witnessed a further blow to global food security as Russia, for the 4th consecutive day, struck Ukraine's Black Sea ports in Odessa, Chornomorsk, and Mykolaiv with missiles and drones, destroying critical port infrastructure, facilities, and grain supplies. These attacks have also resulted in civilian casualties. Yesterday in Odessa, 1 person was reportedly killed and at least 8 others were injured. In Mykolaiv, Russia's attack reportedly killed 2, while 19 more were injured. We strongly condemn these attacks and urge Russia to stop them immediately. As the Secretary General stated yesterday, the bombardment of the Black Sea ports in Ukraine contradicts Russia's commitments under the Memorandum of Understanding with the United Nations, which states that, and I quote, "The Russian Federation will facilitate the unimpeded export of food, sunflower oil, and fertilizers from Ukrainian-controlled Black Sea ports," end quote. The new wave of attacks on Ukrainian ports risks having far-reaching impacts on global food security, in particular in developing countries. Furthermore, as we have repeatedly stated, attacks against civilian infrastructure may constitute a violation of international humanitarian law. Madam President, threats regarding potential targeting of civilian vessels navigating in the Black Sea waters are unacceptable. We are also concerned about the reports of sea mines laid in the Black Sea, endangering civilian navigation. We strongly urge restraint from any further rhetoric or action that could deteriorate the already dangerous situation. Any risk of conflict spillover as a result of a military incident in the Black Sea, whether intentional or by accident, must be avoided at all costs, as this could result in potentially catastrophic consequences to us all. Madam President, attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are not a new trend in this conflict, but rather its tragic pattern. The World Health Organization has documented damage to over 1,000 healthcare facilities, resulting in 101 deaths and 139 injuries. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, UNESCO has verified damage to 270 cultural sites, including 116 religious sites, 27 museums, 95 buildings of historical significance, 19 monuments, 12 libraries, and 1 archive. Moreover, 3,467 educational institutions have also suffered from bombing and shelling, with 335 of them destroyed. According to UNESCO, 12 journalists and media workers have been killed since the start of the war. Also, children in Ukraine continue to be disproportionately affected by the appalling high level of grave violations in this conflict. Children are being killed and maimed by explosive weapons with wide area impact in populated areas. Millions of Ukrainians, including nearly 2/3 of Ukrainian children, have been forced to leave their homes. For those who remain, the damage and destruction of critical infrastructure continues to cause hardships as access to basic services are disrupted. The destruction of the Kakhovka Dam on 6 June and the subsequent flooding have far-reaching long-term environmental and humanitarian consequences. According to Ukraine's Agriculture Ministry, almost 600,000 hectares of farmland no longer have access to irrigation water following the dam destruction. This compounds the existing challenges that Ukrainian farmers face, in addition to mines and unexploded ordnance. The flooding also worsened the already volatile situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Experts of the International Atomic Energy Agency continue to closely monitor the availability of cooling water for the plant. Ensuring its safety and security remains of utmost importance, not just to Ukraine, but to the broader region. Madam President, landmines will continue to pose dangers to civilians for years to come, as almost 1/3 of the country is reportedly contaminated with unexploded ordnance, landmines, and cluster munitions. We are working with the government of Ukraine and other partners to tackle this threat of unexploded ordnance. So far, our mine action efforts have reached almost 3.5 million people. But these figures are not the whole story. The war has impacts that are harder to measure. A generation of Ukrainian children has been traumatized, and the impacts of the war on the mental health of children and adults will be long-lasting. Madam President, when I briefed the Council on Ukraine earlier this week, I did not foresee that I would be returning to this chamber again today. The events of the past week about the latest developments in the Russian Federation's senseless war against its neighbor, a war with consequences that can be felt around the world. Russia's termination of its participation in the Black Sea Initiative, coupled with its bombardment of crucial ports, will further compound this crisis. The Secretary General has been clear. We will not stop our efforts to facilitate the unimpeded access to global markets for food and fertilizers from both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. In closing, Madam President, let me stress that the only way to halt the catastrophe unfolding in Ukraine is to forge an end to the war based on international law, principles enshrined in the Charter, and in line with General Assembly resolutions. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Thank you very much, Madam President. As we have discussed in this chamber before and on many occasions, the war in Ukraine has had a significant impact on the world, as Rosemary has just been outlining, far beyond the country's borders. A world already reeling from an accumulation of shocks of which we are all well aware. The scale of global humanitarian needs under these circumstances is vastly outpacing the resources we have available. Just as a reminder, in my function as an emergency relief coordinator, I'm responsible for the relationship and the representation of the humanitarian community to the 362 million people now in 69 countries who need humanitarian aid, a number that has never been reached anywhere near before. And an unprecedented $55 billion is required to meet the priorities within their needs. Many humanitarian plans, as we have discussed, including this week, remain severely underfunded. So for millions of people around the world already, the margins are fine and their capacity to withstand further shocks is limited. Thus, Madam President, almost exactly a year ago to the day, we celebrated the signing of the Black Sea Initiative and the Memorandum of Understanding on Russian food and fertilizer exports. These agreements were a decisive international response to spiraling food prices that were undermining food security around the world. Their signing also represented something more. It was a demonstration that we could achieve together, with goodwill and good faith, innovative, daring solutions that put humanity above politics, even in the most extreme of circumstances, and in this case, an agreement between those two warring parties. And in the space of 12 months of that day in Istanbul, the Black Sea Initiative has enabled the safe export of close to 33 million metric tons from Ukrainian Black Sea ports to 45 countries, aboard more than 1,000 outbound vessels. I think that's an achievement which, even on that day in Istanbul, we could not have imagined. And it has been so because of the cooperation between the signatories to that agreement, to that historic agreement in war. It's allowed the World Food Programme to transport more than 725,000 metric tons of wheat in support of food assistance operations in Afghanistan, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen, the countries now impacted by recent decisions. And as the Secretary General highlighted earlier this week, the Memorandum of Understanding has also delivered concrete results over the past year, supporting increased volumes of Russian agricultural products to reach global markets. And together, the Istanbul agreements from the 22nd of July contributed to sustained and essential reductions in global food prices, which by last month, before this, were more than 23% below the record highs reached in March of last year. And therefore, of course, Madam President, Monday's confirmation that the Russian Federation was withdrawing from the Black Sea Initiative was immensely disappointing to all of us, and all of us way beyond this chamber. And the developments in the 4 days since, as Rosemary has said, have been alarming. Russian strikes against port facilities, also referred to by Rosemary, in Odessa and other Ukrainian ports, are reported to have injured civilians, damaged infrastructure essential to the export of food, and which were, before Monday, protected installations in those ports because they were aligned to the export of food and relevant products. Ukrainian farmers, as we can imagine, look on at this nightly assault with great anxiety as they harvest now the crops nurtured in the shadow of war and protected and with a future because of the Black Sea Initiative, in spite of risks from landmines, Rosemary has spoken to that, unexploded ordnance, the damage to the dam and the flooding that was consequent upon it, damage to storage facilities, as in this week, and infrastructure, food that they are now harvesting that may no longer be able to reach the global markets that so desperately need them. Global grain prices, as I think we all know, have spiked this week, threatening to undo the hard-won progress achieved over the past year, and this potentially threatens hunger and worse for millions of people. Wheat and corn futures, and I'm quoting from the World Food Programme, have risen by almost 9% and 8% respectively on Wednesday. Wednesday saw the largest single-day increase in wheat prices since the full-scale invasion commenced. And this is not surprising. This was predicted, and it happened. Much of the world relies on the affordability of these staples, which is under threat yet again. Higher prices, of course, will be most acutely felt by families in developing countries already at risk, who tend to spend a much higher share of their household income on food, and we have discussed that in the context of many places of humanitarian need. Escalatory rhetoric also threatens to further undermine the safe transportation of food through the Black Sea more broadly. And with no access to ports or world markets, farmers may have no choice but to stop farming. In addition to the global effects, this would have an immediate impact on domestic food prices and on the economic stability of Ukraine. This in turn would affect food security inside Ukraine and in the region. So the humanitarian catastrophe that continues to unfold in Ukraine, and that we have discussed before and will again, continues to reverberate around the world, and it must end. Civilians and civilian infrastructure, as so often stated, must be respected. As the Secretary General stated yesterday, the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Ukrainian ports, we both referred to this, may also constitute a violation of international humanitarian law. The bottom line is very simple. Food and fertilizer exports from Ukraine and Russian Federation remain still today, despite recent days, of crucial importance to global food security. The United Nations will therefore continue its engagement with all involved to ensure that Russian and Ukrainian food and fertilizer can continue to reach global markets. Unified international support, and I hope from this Council also, is essential if these efforts of advocacy and diplomacy are to be successful. And I want, of course, to reiterate our appreciation of the extraordinary efforts of the government of Turkey in support of and hosting and overseeing so much of the Black Sea Initiative. Madam President, a final, perhaps personal impression. We have all been so deep in the weeds in this project for so long, and therefore this week has been a week of sadness and disappointment. But for many of those 362 million people, it's not a matter of sadness or disappointment. It's a matter of threat to their future and the future of their children and their families. They're not sad, they're angry, they're worried, they're concerned. Some will go hungry, some will starve, many may die as a result of these decisions. And we implore this Council and the world beyond it to help to make every effort to restore the spirit, what the Secretary General at the time referred to as the beacon of hope, that those two agreements represented for all of us in a world of such difficulty and tragedy. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to the briefer requested by the Russian Federation, Mr. Mikhail Khazin.
Madam President, distinguished participants in today's meeting, as an economist, I will attempt to provide more or less an objective economic picture of all of the agreements on the grain deal. First and foremost, it behooves us to note that presently there are no objective criteria for assessment of market costs in connection with this deal. Yes, when it was struck, there was a sudden reduction in costs, but this is linked to the fact that last year there was a significant given the unfortunate circumstances. And let us note that the beginning of the deal coincided with a forecast for future harvests, which was favorable in terms of the costs, so there was nothing surprising here. If we are to consider the volumes of grain provided to Ukraine, then we should note that the majority is corn and barley, which is not provided to poor countries. they are not being used under the food program for them. If we are to talk about wheat, 30 million tons, which was provided, is approximate equitable scale was provided to Ukraine through exports, through other channels, and let us take into account that this grain was commercial. It belonged to private individuals and was under contract. So its impact on the market last year was linked to the fact that this grain was already taken into account in the present balance. If we are to consider the situation over the perspective, a 2-year, 3-year perspective, then the situation differs. For example, the export of grain from Russia increased over the past year, and the Russian Federation essentially increased wheat deliveries. Instead of 35 million tons, it was 58. And there's approximately the same volume will probably be delivered next year, because the reduced harvest this year is insignificant, from approximately 3 to 5%. Let's take into account that in connection with the fact that this grain was not humanitarian in nature, but rather commercial grain, then its impact on deliveries to poor countries is trivial. So the poorest countries received only 3% of this grain. And in this way, the qualitative assessment of the impact of the grain deal in terms of provisions of Ukrainian grain to global markets is essentially not very significant. Likewise, it is impossible to carry out the relevant assessment because in recent years the markets have been excessively unbalanced. And one can note, just for an understanding of the degree to which it is difficult, the situation in the markets is difficult presently. Let us note that in the United States of America, the heightened inflation last year was more than 20%, and today it is minus 9%. So we've seen a deflation process underway. This means that it is absolutely impossible to establish a stable prognosis or forecast of the situation and the market's response to any given factors. This more likely represents a reaction to the 2019 to 2020 quarantine, but in the next few years, this reaction will be significant. Now, turning to the second part of the grain deal, Russia's participation in grain export represents approximately 1/3. So approximately 60 million tons, and the market is 180. So for this reason, the withdrawal of Russian grain from this market will result in collapse. The misfortune lies in the fact that the impact that sanctions policy is having on the logistics of the situation, on the financial situation, means that grain production in Russia is becoming, for export, is becoming not profitable. This year, this problem has not yet arisen, but next year it may turn out that Russian grain deliveries to the market as a result of this policy will significantly plunge, and this will be a real disaster on the markets. The costs will rise very significantly. This is compounded by the factor of Russian fertilizers delivery. Russia represents more than 15% of the global fertilizers market and a significant share of the market of those products that these fertilizers create. For example, ammonia, first and foremost. Fertilizer is future harvest. If this year there is a reduction in the quantity of fertilizers that are introduced, then in 1 year there will be a significant drop in harvests throughout the world. So in other words, the decisions being made today to de facto restrict the Russian Federation, and I said de facto, and here's why. Formally, both the United Nations and the United States of America repeatedly stated that food does not fall under the restrictions category. However, pressure on economic subjects is so great that many of them refuse to cooperate with the Russian Federation on the provision of food and fertilizers. And this inevitably will result in dire problems and significant shortages of grain on global markets in the 1 to 2 year period. Today, we are not in a position to state what kind of an increase in prices this will result in. And this is specifically because of the fact that the markets are very much imbalanced. It is possible that as a result, there will be a collapse of single world food markets, and they will disband into certain regional groups. And this is something that is being discussed about and written about in terms of the effectiveness of food deliveries, and especially in terms of humanitarian functions. This is exceedingly dangerous. This is an exceedingly dangerous situation. And in this connection, to conclude, I wish to state the following. Unfortunately, there are indeed problems related to implementation of both the first deal with the participation of Ukraine and the second with Russia's participation. However, in terms of the impact both on general global markets and on the humanitarian component, limitations for Russia are far more dangerous than Ukrainian exports.
I think we might have lost Mr. Khazin. Can you hear us, Mr. Khazin? While we sort out that problem, I suggest we move on to those council members who wish to make statements. Oh, Mr. Khazin is back. I'm sorry, we lost you momentarily. Please carry on.
I just want to say one last thing. I wanted to say that the deal with the participation of Russia will have far greater negative repercussions on food market prices and the humanitarian situation than the deal that is linked to Ukraine. It seems to me that it needs to be given more significant focus during the discussion for it to be implemented. Thank you for your attention.
I take note of Mr. Khazin's briefing, and I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Gustavo Manrique, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Human Mobility of Ecuador.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Señora Presidenta, agradezco por haber convocado a esta sesión a pedido de Francia y Ecuador. Aprecio también las exposiciones informativas del secretario general adjunto de Asuntos Humanitarios, el señor Martin Griffith, y de la secretaria general adjunta de Asuntos Políticos y Consolidación de la Paz, la señora Rosemary DiCarlo. Escuché con atención también al señor Cassin. Mañana, 22 de julio, se cumple el primer año desde la firma de la Iniciativa de los Cereales del Mar Negro, que el secretario general la calificó como un faro de esperanza. Es lamentable que en lugar de avivarse esa llama, se lleven a cabo acciones que puedan apagarla. Deploro el anuncio de la Federación Rusa de suspender su participación en la referida iniciativa. Ha sido central para aliviar las consecuencias globales de la inseguridad alimentaria que ha sido exacerbada por la agresión militar contra Ucrania. Desde el inicio de la invasión, el secretario general alertó de las consecuencias globales que el conflicto tendría. Esto con mayor dureza sobre las personas con menos recursos, al haber interrumpido la cadena de suministro, llevando el índice de precios de alimentos de la FAO al nivel más alto de la historia. En marzo del 2022, el Ecuador acogió la conferencia regional de la FAO a pocas semanas de haber iniciado la guerra. Las consecuencias regionales y globales se manifestaron desde entonces como una preocupación fundamental para América Latina y el Caribe. Si bien las exportaciones de cereales no constituyen de por sí operaciones de ayuda alimentaria, siguen teniendo un rol vital en el alivio de la inseguridad alimentaria y, por tanto, en la situación humanitaria del mundo. La implementación de la Iniciativa del Grano ha permitido salvar millones de vidas del hambre, en particular en las zonas más frágiles. Así lo ha confirmado en reiteradas ocasiones la FAO o incluso la Conferencia de las Naciones Unidas sobre el Comercio y el Desarrollo, UNCTAD. A esto debemos agregar el impacto que la suspensión tendrá en el marco de las operaciones del Programa Mundial de Alimentos, que beneficiaba a miles de niñas y niños en Afganistán, Yemen y el Cuerno de África, por mencionar solo unos pocos ejemplos. ¿Qué peor manera de implementar la resolución 2417, con la cual este Consejo hace 5 años instó a todas las partes a garantizar el buen funcionamiento de los sistemas y mercados de alimentación en situaciones de conflicto armado? ¿Y qué peor manera de acompañar la decisión de suspender la Iniciativa del Grano que bombardeando las ciudades portuarias de Ucrania y la infraestructura de carga de cereales precisamente en Odessa? Además, serían inaceptables cualquier amenaza o ataque contra embarcaciones civiles en el Mar Negro. El Ecuador insiste en la necesidad de respetar los sistemas de alimentos y de abastecimiento de agua y recuerda la prohibición existente de atacar, destruir, sustraer o inutilizar los bienes indispensables para la supervivencia de la población civil, agrícolas y de cosecha. Por otro lado, nos aflige el impacto cada vez mayor que esta invasión tiene sobre la agricultura y los medios de subsistencia rurales en Ucrania. Esto con decenas de miles de millones de pérdidas para los hogares, destrucción de maquinaria y equipo, instalaciones de almacenamiento, cultivos, insumos y las 600.000 hectáreas de tierra agrícola que nos comentaron. Señora Presidenta, deben parar los ataques contra el personal de respuesta humanitaria y sus sedes, incluyendo Odessa, Mykolaiv, y le insistimos a la Federación Rusa que permita el acceso humanitario en las zonas bajo su control temporal. Insistimos en la necesidad de que las partes respeten irrestrictamente sus obligaciones que derivan del derecho internacional humanitario, incluyendo los principios de distinción, proporcionalidad y de precaución. Nos preocupa la contaminación por minas y remanentes explosivos. Llamamos a las partes a abstenerse de emplear municiones de racimos por el daño colateral que éstas conllevan en el inmediato, así como en el mediano y largo plazo. El Ecuador, como Estado parte de la Convención sobre municiones en racimos, insiste en la prohibición de ese armamento. Finalmente, hacemos un llamado firme para que este Consejo reitere su respaldo a las labores del Secretario General, como ya lo hizo en mayo del 2022. Esa labor seguirá siendo indispensable tanto en el plano humanitario como en los esfuerzos para acercarnos hacia una paz justa y duradera. Esto lo debemos hacer sobre los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Manrique for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame President,
I wish to thank Ms. DiCarlo and Mr. Griffiths for their
la France a
briefings.
demandé avec l'Équateur
Along with Ecuador, called for the convening of this
la Russie a
meeting
franchi
because
cette semaine
Russia
un
this
nouveau
week
seuil
crossed a new
d'irresponsabilité.
threshold of cynicism and a lack of
Nous
responsibility.
avons
We
prétendre ces
have
derniers
all heard
mois
Russia
qu'elle
claim in
était
recent
très
months that it
préoccupée
was
par la
gravely
situation
concerned
des
by
pays
the
les plus pauvres.
situation of the poorest
Après
countries
avoir
in
mis
the
en
world,
péril
after
la
having
sécurité
imperiled
alimentaire et la
food
nutrition
insecurity
mondiale,
and nutrition at a
l'agression
global
d'Ukraine,
level by attacking
elle a
Ukraine.
mis fin il y a quelques
A
jours
few
à
days ago, it
l'initiative
put an end
céréalière de
to
la mer
the Black
Noire.
Sea Grain Initiative.
Le secrétaire
The
général a
Secretary General
souligné le grave
emphasized the
impact
grave
que
impact
cela
that that
aurait
decision
sur
would
les
have
pays
on the
les
most vulnerable countries.
Depuis,
Since that
elle
decision,
bombarde les ports
Russia has
d'Odessa,
shelled the
de
ports of Odessa,
Chornomorsk,
Chornomorsk,
de Mykolaiv,
and Mykolaiv, as well
leurs terminaux
as their
céréaliers,
grain terminals,
sont des
which are
infrastructures
civilian infrastructure.
Le secrétaire général l'a
The
rappelé
Secretary
hier.
General reminded us yesterday the destruction of civilian infrastructure is a violation of international humanitarian law. At a time when millions of people are going hungry, Russia is thought to have already destroyed more than 60,000 tons of grain. Russia also announced via its Ministry of Defense that all vessels heading towards Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea will be considered from the 20th of July at midnight onwards as potentially transporting military goods or equipment. With its action, Russia is committing yet more war crimes, is once again using hunger as a weapon. Russia, in so doing, is making a strategic mistake. Madam President, France condemns in the strongest terms the decision taken by the Russian Federation to put an end to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. With that decision, Russia is agreeing to shoulder responsibility for global food insecurity and malnutrition. This initiative had in 1 year allowed the export of more than around 33 million tons of grain. More than half of that volume went towards low and middle income countries, and the initiative also drove down the prices of agricultural produce by 23%. The World Food Programme had been able to export from Ukrainian ports 7,000 to 5,000 tons of grain towards the countries most affected by hunger, namely Afghanistan, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa. The closing of the Black Sea will increase the cost of humanitarian operations in a context in which resources are already sorely lacking. Russia's decision also risks producing inflationary effects which will primarily affect agriculture and food sectors, as well as producers and the poorest households in the most vulnerable countries. Why has Russia made this choice? By blocking exports from Ukrainian ports and by prompting an increase in food and agriculture prices, Russia is increasing the profits garnered from its own exports. It is increasing its income to finance its war of aggression against Ukraine. That is the reality. Russia is seeking to play the victim and claims that it has been swindled with the Istanbul Accords. However, the Secretary General stated in his statement made on the 17th of July the following: exports of Russian grain have reached particularly high levels since last summer, and the level of its fertilizer exports has almost returned to what it was before the invasion of the 24th of February 2022. Madam President, France hails the efforts of the Secretary General and of Turkey, who strove till the very end and continue to try to save the initiative. The United Nations has worked tirelessly to propose solutions. However, Russia has not even deigned to respond to the proposals made. France will continue for its part, alongside its partners, to step up its efforts to reduce the risks of food insecurity. It has provided food security, nutrition, and sustainable agricultural development assistance to the tune of €840 million in 2022. Yesterday, the Council of the European Union decided to bolster the export capacities of the European Union's solidarity lanes. Those solidarity lanes play a crucial role and made it possible to move 41 million tons of grain out of Ukraine since March 2022. Madam President, the decision taken by Russia to put an end to the Black Sea Grain Initiative will and is amplifying the negative consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Let us state once again, none of the above would have happened if Russia had not invaded Ukraine in the first place. Therefore, once again, we call upon Russia to cease its aggression and to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Madam President, I thank France and Ecuador for calling for this meeting and the briefers for their perspectives. As Ghana understands it, until there's a fundamental shift in the position of the Russian Federation, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was terminated on 17 July, has no further hope of implementation. As diplomats, however, we possess, through dialogue and diplomacy, the capacity to bring hope where hope has been lost, and new life when arrangements we have developed to serve our common interest are struggling to meet our expectations. Therefore, as deeply disappointed as we were with the non-renewal of the initiative, we encourage additional efforts by the United Nations and all countries that have had a role to play in the initiative to help address the concerns that have consistently been expressed with regards to the ancillary MOU, especially relating to the export of Russian ammonia to global markets and the export of agricultural products and fertilizers. For indeed, we believe that despite any limitations that the initiative may have had, it has played a role in the stabilization of the global food prices since July 2022, through the export of more than 32 million tons of food commodities from Ukraine, including the transportation of over 725,000 tons of wheat to countries that desperately needed food stocks under the World Food Programme. The initiative was also a test of how we could create resilience in food supply chains during times of major crisis. While we can learn from the present lessons, its termination would not serve the wider international interest and the cause of global food security. Madam President, we however hold that to sustainably address the knock-on effects that the termination of the initiative could create, we need to double our efforts in finding a path of peace that is acceptable to both parties in the conflict. As we've stated before, the further militarization of the conflict is not likely to significantly change the dynamics on the ground. It would prolong the suffering on both sides and the misery of the world. We therefore reiterate our call on Ukraine and the Russian Federation to cease hostilities and embrace dialogue and diplomacy if they have an interest for long-term peace. As neighbors, we believe they have no choice but to find a way they can peacefully adjust their differences. To consider the possibility of other options may not be a realistic choice. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Madam President, I wish to thank Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths, Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo too, for their briefings and the information provided. We also listened closely to the statement made by Mr. Mikhail Kazin. Ecuador and France proposed that this meeting be convened following the suspension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. That agreement was signed in July 2022. It sparked great hope and allowed us to hope that a certain certain degree of calm would begin to prevail, namely in terms of food security. The armed conflict in Ukraine is one that we have followed with great attention and apprehension for months. That conflict is about to take a turn as dangerous as the one before it. The quadripartite agreement between Russia and Ukraine, signed under the aegis of the UN and Turkey, guaranteed during an entire year the safe export of grain via the Black Sea. That allowed us to avoid a spark in grain prices, as well as it also allowed us to calm the risk of food insecurity in certain regions such as the Horn of Africa that suffer from recurrent drought. Today, we have a global economic context which is worsened by a proliferation of crises, and namely humanitarian crisis. In that context, instability could yet worsen. We urge all parties to really engage in efforts to promote dialogue to find a diplomatic and economic situation which benefits all. We encourage the Secretary General of the United Nations to continue his discussion with all parties to break the current deadlock. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President, and let me thank USG DiCarlo and USG Griffiths for their remarks. Before the special military aggression, Ukraine, one of the breadbaskets of the world, accounted for 12% of corn and around 10% of wheat exports. It produced enough food to feed 400 million people per year, mainly in the countries in Africa and the Middle East. Since 24 February 2021, to have their usual food, those millions needed to have the permission from Russia. Colleagues, last year, with the beginning of the unjustified war in Ukraine, the world went through tremor shocks because of the sudden sharp increase of food prices. Food insecurity disrupted global markets, punished households and terrified governments. Russia scrambled to explain to a disbelieving world its narrative that it was a consequence of the sanctions imposed on it. It made some noise, but failed to convince anyone, just like for almost everything related to its war. Then came the Black Sea Grain Initiative, one of the few positive news and achievements on the diplomatic front, and thanks to sincere efforts by Turkey and the Secretary General. It suddenly eased the markets, stabilized the prices, and calmed the world. It was a beacon of reason in an ocean of despair. The narrative of the sanctions disappeared, and the world, especially the global south, breathed with relief. And indeed, about 61% of the nearly 33 million of tons of exported grain out of Ukraine has shipped to low and middle-income countries, including 65% of wheat alone, until the 27th of July, when Russia decided it was time to gamble again. To be fair, it did not come as a surprise. Russia has long been nervous and unhappy with the deal, and it did not hide it. In October last year, there were 10 ships inspected per day, then 7 in November, falling down to 2 in May, while the real capacity for inspection was for 40 ships a day. On the other side, Russian food exports, not under any sanction, it must be highlighted, are higher than last year, and it is exporting plenty of grain and fertilizers out of Novorossiysk. So what is wrong? In the course of these long months of war, we have learned that in order to understand the reality, one should not rely on what Russia says, but rather on what it omits. Kremlin is now conditioning any future participation in the grain deal as a chip to get EU sanctions relief. Russian agricultural producers have been complaining about prices in global markets for these commodities. They wanted to make more money, and for that you need to increase the price. In the world that we have built, a quick reference to the international rules-based order, this is done by fair competition, not brutal imposition. But this is what Russia tries to do with its oil. This is what they did with their gas, and now again with food. In a war that they are not winning, everything must be used as a weapon. Colleagues, Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports has since the very first day been a deliberate effort to strangle Ukraine's economy. After more than 500 days of a disastrous war, the goal remains the same: just as it is destroying its civilian infrastructure,
al igual que
just
destruyen las
like it is killing its people,
infraestructuras civiles
just
y matan
like
a
it is
su
abducting its
gente y
children.
secuestran a sus
Now,
niños.
as mentioned by USG DiCarlo
Ahora,
and
como ha
other
dicho la
colleagues,
señora
Russia is attacking on a
DiCarlo y
daily
otros
basis
colegas, Rusia
with the
ataca
aim to destroy
diariamente
Ukraine's ports,
a fin
including
de
in
destruir
Odessa,
los
a
puertos
city
ucranianos,
inscribed in the
incluso
World
en
Heritage List
Odessa,
by
una
UNESCO.
ciudad que es patrimonio mundial
But Russia is not
de la
punishing
humanidad
Ukraine
según la
only.
UNESCO. Pero
Ending
Rusia
the
no
deal
solo
would
castiga a
destabilize
Ucrania.
global food prices and
Acabar
jeopardize
con
the
el
most
acuerdo
food insecure
desestabiliza los
countries
precios
and
mundiales y
populations.
castiga
At
a
the time when
los
climate
países y
change,
poblaciones más
conflict,
inseguros. En
political
un mundo en que el
instability,
cambio
and other
climático, el
factors
conflicto
have
y
already
la
caused
inestabilidad y otros
rising levels of
factores
food
ya han
insecurity.
aumentado la
According
inseguridad
to UN
alimentaria.
Comtrade,
Según
imports from
las
Ukraine as a
cifras
share of
de la
total
ONU,
wheat imports count for 75%
el
for Lebanon,
75% de los cereales en el Líbano vienen de
49%
Ucrania,
for Libya,
59%
and 45% for Ethiopia.
de Pakistán y el 45% de Etiopía, por mencionar tan solo un puñado de países de la larga lista. Si una barra de pan cuesta más dinero o desaparece de los supermercados, la gente tiene que saber quién es el culpable, porque acabar con el acuerdo supone jugar a la ruleta rusa con el alimento de los pobres y las necesidades de los necesitados. Quizás no se entienda que un hombre va a provocar hambruna en el mundo en aras de sus fines políticos, pero simplemente es cuestión de tiempo que todos entiendan que por hacerse pasar por un hombre fuerte causando el hambre está demostrando su debilidad y su cinismo. Gracias. Gracias a Albania. Tiene ahora la palabra la representación de Suiza. Gracias, presidente. Quiero empezar dando las gracias a la secretaria general adjunta, Rosemary DiCarlo, y al secretario general adjunto, Martin Griffiths, por sus presentaciones. En nombre de mi país, Suiza, les estamos muy agradecidos por sus trabajos incansables para aliviar el sufrimiento de la población civil. Una vez más, llegamos al final de una semana cargada de noticias negativas en cuanto a la agresión militar de Rusia contra Ucrania. Nuevos ataques, nuevas víctimas civiles y nueva destrucción. Más incertidumbres también para los habitantes de Ucrania y de todo el mundo, en verdad. Según informes creíbles, en Mykolaiv, cerca de Odessa, un ataque aéreo golpeó viviendas e incluso una guardería. Estos ataques son crueles e inadmisibles. Suiza está muy preocupada por esta escalada aparente que afecta a civiles y sus infraestructuras al sur de Ucrania. Recordamos que el derecho internacional humanitario prohíbe ataques contra población e infraestructuras civiles y también represalias, sobre todo contra personas y bienes protegidos. Las reglas sobre hostilidades deben respetarse de manera imperativa. También condenamos los ataques rusos contra los puertos de Odessa y otros del Mar Negro, puertos ucranianos. Estas decisiones, como la tomada por Rusia sobre la iniciativa del Mar Negro, tienen repercusiones que van más allá de Ucrania. Los acuerdos de Estambul han sido esenciales para la seguridad alimentaria de todo el mundo, así se ha dicho. La iniciativa del Mar Negro permitió exportar más de 32 millones de toneladas de alimentos desde Ucrania hacia 45 países en 3 continentes y contribuyó a reducir los precios alimentarios a nivel mundial y permitió despachar más de 725.000 toneladas de trigo por parte del PMA en apoyo de sus operaciones humanitarias. Reafirmamos nuestra profunda lamentación porque Rusia haya decidido no prolongar la iniciativa. Nos tememos que esta decisión agravará la situación de dificultades y afecta sobre todo a los más pobres. Nos inquietan también los riesgos de desestabilización que tiene la inseguridad alimentaria en numerosas regiones del mundo. Suiza está convencida de que reconducir la iniciativa redundaría en interés de la seguridad alimentaria mundial. Nos preocupa la escalada militar y la retórica que se ha utilizado desde la decisión rusa y pedimos cautela en cuanto a cualquier acto perjudicial, sobre todo en cuanto a la navegación civil. Celebramos los esfuerzos incansables del secretario general y Turquía y los demás actores implicados para facilitar el acceso rápido e irrestricto a los mercados mundiales de productos alimentarios y fertilizantes desde Ucrania y Rusia. Estamos dispuestos a seguir apoyando estos esfuerzos, sobre todo como país anfitrión. Señora Presidente, la firma de los acuerdos de Estambul hace un año fue uno de los pocos momentos de esperanza desde el inicio de la agresión militar de Rusia contra Ucrania. Esto demuestra que incluso en los peores momentos se pueden encontrar soluciones diplomáticas en pos de un interés más amplio. Esto nos recuerda que la humanidad y tener en cuenta a los más vulnerables debe y puede conseguirse. Estos acontecimientos de la última semana son contrarios a lo que venimos pidiendo desde febrero de 2022. Esta tendencia a la escalada debe cesar y cuanto más dura la agresión, más grandes son sus repercusiones. Y tenemos nuestro llamado a Rusia a desescalar la situación, cesar las operaciones y retirar sus tropas del territorio de Ucrania. Gracias.
Gracias a Suiza por su declaración. Ahora tiene la palabra China. Señora Presidenta, gracias a la secretaria general adjunta DiCarlo y al secretario general adjunto Griffiths por sus intervenciones. También hemos escuchado con atención las palabras del señor Hassin. La iniciativa del Mar Negro es fundamental para estabilizar el mercado mundial de alimentos. Y el memorando de entendimiento también lo es. Deberían aplicarse ambos de forma equilibrada, atendiendo las preocupaciones de las partes. La Federación de Rusia en los últimos días ha dicho varias veces que está dispuesta a volver a sumarse a la iniciativa del Mar Negro si se avanza considerablemente para eliminar los obstáculos de exportación de productos de Rusia. El secretario general Guterres también ha dicho que va a hacer todo lo posible para que los fertilizantes y cereales de Ucrania y Rusia lleguen a los mercados del mundo. Esperemos que todas las partes actúen para mantener la seguridad alimentaria en el mundo y permitir el acceso a alimentos a los países en desarrollo que lo necesiten, que sigan trabajando con las agencias de la ONU para acercar posturas y conseguir, como decíamos, una solución equilibrada a las preocupaciones legítimas de todas las partes para que se reanuden las exportaciones de fertilizantes y alimentos de los dos países. La situación en Ucrania lleva tiempo agravándose y sale a la luz una tendencia muy clara. Muchas infraestructuras civiles importantes han sido bombardeadas y por eso pedimos a las partes que ejerzan cautela, que mantengan la calma y respeten el DIH y los principios de proporcionalidad, etcétera, que renuncien a atacar infraestructuras civiles y a civiles y que hagan todo lo posible para controlar la expansión del conflicto, para evitar una crisis humanitaria a mayor escala todavía. Señora Presidenta, la forma de resolver la situación humanitaria de Ucrania es conseguir una solución política de la cuestión de Ucrania. Una vez más, pedimos a las partes implicadas que vuelvan cuanto antes a la mesa de negociación. Pedimos a la comunidad internacional que cree las condiciones propicias en este sentido. Sobre la cuestión de Ucrania, siempre hemos pedido que la integridad soberana y territorial de todos los países debe protegerse. Los principios y objetivos de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas tienen que respetarse y también hay que tener en cuenta muy en serio las preocupaciones de las partes. Necesitamos más esfuerzos para resolver la crisis de forma pacífica. Vamos a seguir estando del lado de la paz y el diálogo y trabajaremos de forma incansable con la comunidad internacional para promover una solución política a la cuestión de Ucrania. Gracias. Gracias a la representante de China. Y ahora tiene la palabra Estados Unidos. Gracias, señora Presidenta. Y gracias a los secretarios generales adjuntos Griffiths y DiCarlo por su sinceridad. Gracias también a Ecuador y a Francia que han pedido que se convocara esta importante reunión. Señoras y señores, parece que semana tras semana Rusia sigue avanzando. Por ejemplo, la semana pasada unilateralmente bloqueó la posibilidad de ampliar el mecanismo de asistencia a Siria y esta semana han suspendido su participación en la Iniciativa del Mar Negro, un arreglo que estaba permitiendo llevar comida a los más vulnerables del mundo, sobre todo en Oriente Medio y en África. Nos han dicho los ponentes, uno de ellos, que esto es peccata minuta, pero para las personas que reciben esta ayuda esto no puede ser así. Por eso, este miércoles, cuando el Kremlin atacó con misiles los puertos, asesinando a civiles y destruyendo 60.000 toneladas de cereales, repito, 60.000 toneladas de cereales, según el Programa Mundial de Alimentos, esto es suficiente para dar de comer a más de 270.000 personas durante un año. Y cuando esta semana Rusia anunció que todos los buques con destino a puertos de Ucrania del Mar Negro serán considerados como posibles buques de transporte de armas con fines militares, algo que se habría podido evitar si se respetasen las garantías del acuerdo. Y cuando Rusia anoche lanzó otra serie de ataques en la zona de Odessa, lo que vemos es que está declarando la guerra contra la cadena mundial de suministro de alimentos en un momento en el que las necesidades son enormes y en el que, ya lo sabemos, la gente va a morir. Tenemos información que apunta a que el ejército de Rusia va a ampliar los ataques contra infraestructuras y buques civiles del Mar Negro. Según nuestros datos, Rusia ha colocado más minas en las zonas que rodean los puertos ucranianos del Mar Negro. Este es un esfuerzo coordinado para justificar cualquier ataque contra buques civiles en el Mar Negro y echar la culpa a Ucrania. Después de más de 500 días de una invasión a gran escala de Ucrania, es fácil quedarse o no inmutarse ante estas campañas de Rusia, pero no podemos aceptar que esto se convierta en la nueva normalidad o en el comportamiento responsable de un miembro permanente del Consejo de Seguridad encargado de mantener la paz y la seguridad internacionales. Rusia, sin embargo, ha acabado con la paz y la seguridad en todo el mundo. Sus acciones van en contra de todo lo que representa este Consejo. Desde los primeros días de esta guerra no provocada e ilegal contra Ucrania, Rusia utiliza los alimentos como armas y convierte los campos en campos de batalla. Los siembra con bombas y minas e intenta destruir también el material y la infraestructura. Moscú debe cesar estos ataques contra las tierras agrícolas de Ucrania y sus infraestructuras. Incluso antes de salirse de la Iniciativa del Mar Negro, Rusia se negaba a aplicar por completo el acuerdo y a menudo impedía que los buques cargados de alimentos salieran de los puertos. A pesar de esto, la Iniciativa del Cereal estaba cambiando las cosas, estaba ayudando a dar de comer al mundo. Y esto no es cualquier cosa poco importante como se nos quiere hacer creer. Estamos hablando de los alimentos para todos. Recordemos que con estas iniciativas el Programa Mundial de Alimentos ha podido reforzar su presencia en Yemen, Afganistán o Somalia. Además, así se ha facilitado la exportación de 32 millones de toneladas métricas de alimentos desde Ucrania y cereales. Estas cifras son enormes y sabemos que 2/3 de las exportaciones con arreglo a este acuerdo han llegado a países en desarrollo. El primer buque que salió del Mar Negro conforme a este acuerdo llegó al Líbano y desde entonces, gracias a la Iniciativa del Cereal del Mar Negro, los buques han llevado alimentos a puertos de toda África y Oriente Medio, de Sudán a Etiopía o a Libia. Pero el día mismo en el que Rusia suspendió su participación en la iniciativa,
los precios mundial del cereal se dispararon. Los exportadores rusos ya se están beneficiando de millones de personas que no pueden permitirse pagar estos precios. Son sobre todo personas de Oriente Medio y de África. Seamos claros, Rusia no tiene ningún motivo legítimo para suspender su participación en el acuerdo. Dirán que las sanciones han bloqueado sus exportaciones, pero esto no podría estar más alejado de la verdad. Están exportando más cereal que nunca y a precios más altos. Rusia sencillamente está utilizando el Mar Negro como chantaje para avanzar en su agenda política y está poniendo a toda la humanidad de rehén. Señoras y señores, las Naciones Unidas y Turquía han dicho muy claramente que quieren que siga adelante el acuerdo y Ucrania ha dicho públicamente que también quiere que siga este acuerdo. El mundo claramente quiere seguir adelante con esta iniciativa. Ahora los ojos del mundo están mirando a Rusia y no es tarde para que Moscú dé un paso atrás en su decisión y amplíe y respete por completo la iniciativa del cereal del Mar Negro. Quiero aprovechar esta ocasión para dar las gracias a las Naciones Unidas y a Turquía por todo lo que han hecho para intentar que siga vivo el acuerdo. El Consejo y todos los Estados miembros deben trabajar unidos y pedir a Rusia que vuelva a las negociaciones cuanto antes para acabar con esta atroz guerra de Ucrania, por el bien del mundo y por el bien de los que pasan hambre en el mundo y el de la humanidad. Gracias, señora presidenta. Gracias a Estados Unidos por su declaración y ahora tiene la palabra Mozambique.
Madam President,
Señora presidenta,
I wish to express Mozambique's gratitude
en nombre
to the
de
presidency
Mozambique,
for convening
gracias
this
a la
important
presidencia
meeting.
por convocar esta
I also wish
importante
to
reunión
thank
y
the
gracias
briefers.
también a los
Madam
oradores.
President,
Señora presidenta,
the Black Sea
la
Initiative
iniciativa del Mar Negro
was a
era un
life-standing
acuerdo
arrangement
de supervivencia
brokered by the United
negociado
Nations Secretary
por el
General.
secretario general de las
We
Naciones
praise
Unidas
such
y
initiative.
aplaudimos aquella
It
iniciativa,
enabled
gracias a la
nearly
cual casi
32
32
million
millones
tons
de
of
toneladas
Ukrainian
de cereales de
grain to
Ucrania
reach
alcanzaron
global
los
markets,
mercados mundiales,
nearby mitigating the
controlándose
needs of
así
people
o
around the
reduciéndose
globe.
así las necesidades de ciudadanos del mundo
The
entero.
Secretary General rightly
El secretario
lauded
general
this initiative
describió
as a
con
beacon of
razón
hope
esta iniciativa como
in a
un faro
troubling
de
world.
esperanza en un mundo atormentado.
The suspension of this
La
initiative
suspensión de la
is a
iniciativa,
settle
sin duda,
to amplify global
aumentará
socio-economic
los problemas
stresses in a
socioeconómicos del
world
mundo,
already grappling with
ahora
a
que
perfect storm of
ya estamos
conflict,
lidiando con la
climate
tormenta
change,
perfecta de
and
conflictos,
a
cambio
dwelling
climático
confidence
y una
in
confianza
our
menguante
collective
en
ability
nuestra
to
capacidad
negotiate
colectiva
and
de
adhere to
negociar y
multilateral
respetar las
solutions.
soluciones multilaterales.
We are told that global
Se
food
nos dice
index
que
are already showing sharp increase.
los índices de
Humanitarian
precios
agencies
de
are
alimentos
preparing for potential
se están disparando.
food
Las
shortages
agencias
and
humanitarias se
increased
están preparando
hunger in
para
conflict-affected
escasez de
areas.
alimentos y aumento de hambre en las
Madam
zonas afectadas por
President,
los conflictos.
we
Señora
acknowledge the
presidenta,
concerns
somos
regarding
conscientes de las
the implementations
preocupaciones
of twin
que rodean
memorandum that
a la
facilitates
aplicación del memorando
the export
que
of grain
facilita
and
la
agricultural
exportación
products.
de cereales y productos agrícolas.
According to UN
Según
data,
datos de las Naciones Unidas,
around
aproximadamente el
3% of
3% de
export
las
under Black
exportaciones
Sea
de la
deal
iniciativa del Mar
has
Negro
gone to
han
low-income
llegado
countries,
a países de
while
ingresos
high-income
bajos.
countries
Los
get
países de
around
ingresos altos han recibido aproximadamente el
and the rest
44%
to the
y el
mid-income
resto
states.
ha ido destinado a países de
Mozambique,
ingresos medios. Mozambique, por lo
urges
tanto,
all parties
pide a todas las
and the
partes
guarantors of the
y
Black
a los
Sea
garantes de
Grain
la iniciativa del
Initiative
cereal del Mar Negro
to follow
que
the
sigan
example
el
set
ejemplo
by Secretary
del
General,
secretario general
who
que
reaffirmed
reafirmó
is a willing
su firme
commitment to
compromiso de
facilitating the
facilitar
transport
el
of
envío
the food products
de
and
alimentos y
fertilizers
fertilizantes
from both
desde
Ukraine
Ucrania
and
y
Russia
desde Rusia
to international markets.
a los mercados
We
internacionales.
urge all
Pedimos
parties to see
a todas
aside
las partes que dejen de lado sus diferencias,
their differences, bearing in mind
conscientes
the hardship
de que
that
esta
is likely
situación
to be caused by suspensions of
probablemente
these arrangements.
se agrave tras la suspensión del acuerdo.
Una
vez más, tenemos ante nosotros
more lesson
una
that bears
lección
testimony to the fact that humanitarian problems
que
require
nos
a
demuestra
political
que los problemas
solution.
humanitarios necesitan
In
soluciones
this regard,
políticas. Y en este
Mozambique
sentido,
reiterates
reiteramos
it is
nuestro
call for
llamamiento
an immediate cessation of
a que
hostilities
cesen inmediatamente las
and the
hostilidades
resumption
y
of
se
direct
reanuden
negotiations between
las
the
negociaciones
parts
directas entre
in
las
full
partes,
compliance with the
tal y como
purposes
prevén
and the principles
la
of
Carta de
UN
las Naciones
Charter.
Unidas en sus
I
principios
thank
y
you, Madam
objetivos.
President.
Gracias, señora
I thank
presidenta.
the representative of
Gracias
Mozambique
al
for their
representante de
statement,
Mozambique
and I
por
now
su
give the floor to
declaración.
the
Y ahora
representative of the United
tiene
Arab
la
Emirates.
palabra los Emiratos
Madam
Árabes
President,
Unidos. Señora presidenta,
I'd like to thank
me
Undersecretary
gustaría
General
darle las
DiCarlo
gracias a la
and
secretaria
Undersecretary
adjunta
General Griffith
DiCarlo
for
y
their
al secretario
informative
general
briefings,
adjunto
and we listened
Griffiths por
carefully to
sus
Mr.
intervenciones.
Mikhail
También hemos
Kazin.
escuchado con atención
I
al
also welcome
señor
the participation
Kazin.
of Ukraine in this
Celebramos
meeting.
la participación de Ucrania en esta reunión. Le
Earlier
damos
this
la
week,
bienvenida.
the Council
Esta misma
shortly
semana
after
el
the
Consejo
convened shortly after the news
se
that the Black
reunió
Sea Grain
poco
Initiative would
después de
not
la
be extended.
iniciativa o de
In
la
the short
noticia,
time
mejor dicho, de
since,
que no se ampliaba
wheat
la
futures
iniciativa
have continued to
del
rise,
Mar Negro
portending further
y la
difficulties for developing
situación se sigue
countries in
agravando, se
securing
avecinan más
necessary
problemas para
staples.
los países
If nothing
en
is done,
desarrollo.
this will
Si
lead to
no se
heightened
hace
hunger
nada,
and
esto
food
va
insecurity.
a provocar más hambre y más
After a
inseguridad
year of
alimentaria.
respite during which the
Después de
Black
un
Sea
año
Grain
de
Initiative
descanso o
contributed
de
to a fall in
tranquilidad
prices,
gracias
the world
a
now
la
faces the
iniciativa
threat
del Mar
of
Negro,
destabilized
ahora el mundo
markets
tiene
and
ante
food
sí la
shortages,
amenaza de
yet again for
mercados
the most vulnerable.
desestabilizados
The
y
initiative
alimentos
and the memorandum
insuficientes
of
para los más
understanding on the
vulnerables.
export of
El
Russian
memorándum de
fertilizers and food
entendimiento
products have indeed
sobre la
had a
exportación de
significant
fertilizantes y
impact on
alimentos
global food
sin duda ha
security.
tenido una repercusión
These
positiva
agreements
sobre
were
la cadena
not
mundial de
perfect by
suministro de
any
alimentos.
means,
Los
yet
acuerdos,
they
por supuesto,
resulted
no
in
eran
over 32
perfectos.
million metric
Aún así,
tons of
gracias a
Ukrainian
ellos,
grain and foodstuffs
32
being shipped to the
millones de
world. As
toneladas
such, they
de
fast became a
alimentos y
lifeline for
fertilizantes de
those
Ucrania
who
se
needed them
exportaron al
most.
resto del mundo,
The
convirtiéndose
UAE
así
deeply
en
regrets that
un
the
ingrediente
initiative
para la
has not been
supervivencia
extended.
de muchos y lamentamos que
That
no se haya
said,
ampliado la
we commend the
iniciativa.
ongoing
Dicho
efforts of the
esto,
Secretary
felicitamos los
General and the
esfuerzos en
United
curso del
Nations to
secretario general y de las
facilitate the
Naciones
continued
Unidas
transport
para
of food products
facilitar
and
el
fertilizers
envío de
from both
fertilizantes y otros
Ukraine and
productos
Russia to
desde Ucrania y
international
Rusia a
markets.
los mercados internacionales.
The Black Sea Grain
La
Initiative was
iniciativa
born
del
out
Mar
of
Negro
extensive diplomatic
nació
efforts and dialogue,
tras muchos
one of
esfuerzos
very few
diplomáticos y
positive
muchas
developments
negociaciones
amidst the
cuando se
shadow
habían
of war in
producido
Ukraine throughout the
pocos
past 18
avances
months.
con la
Now is
guerra de
not the time
Ucrania.
to walk away.
Ahora no es el momento,
On
sin
the
embargo, de
contrary,
alejarnos, sino
it
que
is
por el
time to build
contrario
on any
es
positive
hora
steps
ya
to
de
secure a new way
hacer todo lo
forward.
posible para conseguir una nueva
Madam
forma de
President, this
avanzar.
conflict
Señora
is not the
Presidenta,
sole
este
reason
conflicto
for
no
the
es el
food
único motivo
insecurity
por
crisis we
el cual
face.
estamos viviendo una
The World
crisis de
Food
inseguridad
Program's
alimentaria.
increasingly dire
El
warnings
Programa Mundial de
about rising
Alimentos
food
cada vez hace
prices
unas
precede the
advertencias
war.
más preocupantes
But
sobre
the
la subida
events
de
of the
los
last year
precios
and
de
a
los
half
alimentos.
have
Y esto lo hacía antes de la guerra. Sin
significantly
embargo, lo que ha
exacerbated this
sucedido
trend.
durante el último año y medio ha agravado todavía más
Most
la
member
situación.
states continue
La
to
mayoría de
call
los
for an
Estados
end
miembros
to this
siguen
war,
pidiendo que cese la guerra,
a
que
war
termine
that
la
has
guerra. Una
visited
guerra
immense suffering
que ha
upon Ukrainians,
provocado enorme
compounded hardships
sufrimiento
for
para
hundreds
los
of millions of
ucranianos, ha
people around the
agravado
world,
por
and strained the multilateral system.
el sufrimiento de cientos de millones de
While it
personas
is
que están en el
vital
mundo
that
y además el
Ukrainian
sistema
and Russian food and
multilateral también ha
fertilizer
sufrido
return
por
to
ello. Es
global
fundamental
markets,
que vuelvan
we
los
must not let
fertilizantes y
this
alimentos
issue
de
obscure
Ucrania
the
y
wider
Rusia a los
context.
mercados. Ahora, no debemos
Ultimately,
olvidar el
only
contexto más
peace,
general,
just and
porque en última
sustainable, will
instancia la
help
paz
rectify the
justa y
turmoil
sostenible es lo
we
que
are seeing
permitirá
both within
corregir
and beyond Ukraine.
estas crisis que se están produciendo
This
en
is what the
Ucrania y en el resto
overwhelming
del
majority
mundo.
of UN member
Esto es
states
lo
have
que
called
están
for,
pidiendo la mayoría
a
aplastante
peace
de los
that is
Estados
in
miembros
line
en
with
las
the UN
Naciones
Charter
Unidas, una paz
and respects
conforme a la
Ukraine's
Carta de las
sovereignty,
Naciones Unidas y que
independence, and
respete
territorial
la soberanía,
integrity.
independencia
Thank
e
you, Madam
integridad
President.
territorial de Ucrania.
I thank the representative of the United
Gracias al
Arab Emirates for their
representante de los
statement,
Emiratos
and
Árabes
I now
Unidos por
give
su
the floor to the
intervención.
representative of Malta.
Y ahora tiene la palabra Malta.
Thank you, President.
Gracias.
gracias.
And I also thank USG DiCarlo and USG Griffiths for their briefings. Malta strongly condemns Russia's unilateral decision to terminate the Black Sea Grains Initiative. We see this decision for what it is.
Con la iniciativa del Mar Negro, esta decisión, ya sabemos lo que es otro ejemplo lamentable de la politización de las necesidades humanitarias que solo van a conseguir agravar la crisis mundial de seguridad de los alimentos. Está muy claro para todos que la culpa de todo esto la tiene Rusia. Utilizar las armas como alimentos es completamente inaceptable e inconsciente. Es fundamental restaurar la aplicación de esta iniciativa reequilibrar los mercados mundiales de alimentos y contribuir a que Ucrania pueda exportar sus cereales a los países que más lo necesitan. Esta iniciativa había sido fundamental para facilitar las exportaciones de cereales de Ucrania a los mercados internacionales desde que se creó. Con su aplicación, la iniciativa permitió el envío seguro de más de 32 millones de toneladas métricas de productos alimentarios básicos desde los puertos de Ucrania. Con esta iniciativa también se han enviado una cantidad importante de cereal a través de los buques fletados por el Programa Mundial de Alimentos, que han ofrecido ayuda esencial a los esfuerzos humanitarios de Afganistán, Etiopía, Kenia, Sudán, Somalia y Yemen. A pesar de que Rusia afirma lo contrario, más de la mitad del cereal y 2/3 del trigo de la iniciativa se han enviado a países en desarrollo. Algunos han llegado a las regiones con más inseguridad alimentaria del mundo, como el Cuerno de África, Sahel, Yemen o Afganistán. Con esta iniciativa se han controlado los precios de los alimentos, que se redujeron prácticamente un 25% desde marzo de 2022. Todos los envíos han contribuido a reducir las dificultades de los países más pobres del mundo, puesto que se han reducido los precios de los mercados para todos. Condenamos firmemente, señora presidenta, los recientes ataques de Rusia contra el puerto de Chornomorsk, en el sur de Ucrania, en los que se destruyeron 60.000 toneladas de trigo destinado a China, y también se destruyeron infraestructuras de exportación de cereal. Condenamos también los bombardeos nocturnos a los puertos de Odessa y Mykolaiv y sus alrededores. Estos actos deplorables tienen por objeto paralizar el funcionamiento de estas infraestructuras fundamentales para las exportaciones de Ucrania. Nos preocupan también las declaraciones de funcionarios rusos que indican que todos los buques que transitan hacia los puertos ucranianos del Mar Negro serán considerados posibles objetivos militares. Rusia debe renunciar a bloquear de forma ilegal estos puertos y permitir la libre navegación por el Mar Negro. Cerrar el corredor humanitario del Mar Negro tendrá consecuencias sobre las cosechas de la próxima temporada. Los agricultores de Ucrania no van a plantar si no van a poder comercializar sus cosechas. Y esto lo sentirán sobre todo las poblaciones más vulnerables que tendrán que pagar más por comer. Ante esta situación, que las líneas de solidaridad de la Unión Europea van a seguir ayudando a Ucrania para facilitar la exportación de sus productos agrícolas al mundo. La seguridad alimentaria en el mundo está ahora mismo en situación de más riesgo. Al seguir instrumentalizando los alimentos, Rusia es responsable de todos estos choques que están sufriendo la cadena de suministro de cereales y también el aumento de la inflación a escala internacional. Cuando no hay alimentos, esto lo notan millones de personas, sobre todo se hace notar en sectores como la salud, la educación o la cohesión social. Pedimos, pues, exhortamos a Rusia a que cambie el rumbo, a que recapacite su decisión y vuelva a sumarse a la iniciativa del Mar Negro. La colaboración y la estabilidad en los productos alimentarios y los fertilizantes son fundamentales para que haya seguridad alimentaria y para que se alivie el sufrimiento de la población vulnerable de las regiones que dependen mucho de estas exportaciones. La reunión de hoy muestra una vez más las enormes consecuencias de esta guerra absurda, ilegal y no provocada. Nos han vuelto a recordar las consecuencias devastadoras que está teniendo no solo sobre la región, sino también en el resto del mundo. Solo podemos reiterar en los términos más enérgicos que Rusia debe renunciar a esta agresión y retirarse de inmediato y por completo con todas sus fuerzas y equipos militares de todo el territorio de Ucrania dentro de sus fronteras reconocidas por la comunidad internacional.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Japón tiene la palabra.
I thank Mr. Griffiths, Ms. DiCarlo, and the civil society briefer for their briefings. The global food supply, already compromised by various factors, has been further exacerbated by Russia's aggression against Ukraine for over 500 days now. Sadly, this situation has deteriorated even further following Russia's decision on July 17th to terminate the Black Sea Grain Initiative, BSGI. Japan condemns this deplorable action by Russia, noting that Russia has already been a significant impediment to the proper functioning of this initiative for several months. Since its initiation last year, the BSGI has played a pivotal role in ensuring global food security. Through this initiative, more than 32 million tons of grain and other commodities have been transported from Ukrainian ports. Furthermore, over 725,000 tons of grain have been distributed through the World Food Programme, aiding humanitarian operations in some of the most severely impacted areas globally, such as Afghanistan, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa. Despite the significant challenges posed by conflict, climate change, and escalating energy prices, the initiative has led to a remarkable reduction in food prices by over 23% since last March. Japan is gravely concerned about the adverse effects Russia's decision could have on global food supplies, particularly for vulnerable people. Indeed, it is alarming to witness the higher volatility in global wheat prices following Russia's various actions starting from the termination of the initiative. Russia also threatens to treat civilian vessels bound for Ukraine ports as potential military targets. It is Russia alone who must take responsibility for all the repercussions resulting from its decision. Japan categorically condemns Russia's attacks on Ukraine and Black Sea port areas, resulting in numerous civilian casualties and the reported destruction of at least 60,000 tons of essential grain destined for export. It is crucial to remember that the attacks on civilian infrastructure may constitute a violation of international humanitarian law. Madam President, we commend the painstaking effort of the United Nations and the government of Turkey in the extension and implementation of the BSGI. I also wish to recall the Hiroshima Action Statement for Resilient Global Food Security issued in May, which advocates for the maximal and continued implementation of the BSGI. Japan strongly urges Russia to cease weaponization of food, which will never work for legitimizing its heinous act of violence, and promptly return to the international framework to resume grain exports. Madam President, our collective commitment to mitigating global hunger and maintaining stable food prices worldwide must not falter. In this context, Japan supports the EU's Solidarity Lanes initiative to transport Ukrainian grain and food by land. And for its part, Japan has committed more than $250 million to facilitate Ukrainian grain exports and to provide food-related assistance to vulnerable people in regions such as the Middle East and Africa. Moreover, we have backed the restoration of Ukraine's agricultural production capacity, severely compromised by Russia's aggression. Earlier this year, in March, Japan supplies sunflower and corn seeds to 400 smallholder farmers in Kharkiv, with a particular focus on women and young farmers, where war has significantly reduced agricultural productivity and income. Madam President, Japan will continue its efforts to secure the global food supply, thereby contributing to the stabilization of global markets in partnership with the international community. Will we hear or heard some so-called objective analysis or arguments which aimed at minimizing the importance of the BSGI. But colleagues, we heard voices of concern around this very table, especially from countries that could be directly hit. And also we are witnessing actions that obstruct Ukrainian agriculture export and production. So truth is simple. All these concerns or hardships
Todas estas
are
preocupaciones,
meaninglessly
todas estas
caused, or at
adversidades,
least
las
hugely
están
exacerbated
provocando o se
by the
están quedando
unprovoked war.
exacerbadas
The
por
most
la
effective
guerra
and
no
straightforward
provocada.
solution to all
La
of these concerns and
solución más
hardships
sencilla para
would
todos
be
estos
Russia's
problemas y
immediate
dificultades
and
sería que
unconditional
Rusia
withdrawal of
se
its forces
retirara de
from
forma inmediata y sin
Ukraine
condiciones
to end the
de
war.
Ucrania, poniéndose así punto
I thank
final
the
a la guerra.
representative of
Gracias.
Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the
Gracias a
representative of the
Japón
Russian
por su
Federation.
declaración. Ahora tiene la palabra la Federación de Rusia.
Thank you, Madam President.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
We thank you for the invitation,
Gracias por haber
for the brief
invitado
proposed by us and for the rational approach vis-à-vis the number of delegations allowed to participate at this time under Rule 37. Distinguished colleagues, we listened attentively to your statements, and once again, we were surprised at the degree of the cynicism of the Western members of the Security Council, their desire to hide the truth and to engage in wishful thinking. The majority of you, to one degree or another, expressed concern in connection with the suspension of operations of the so-called grain initiative, which allowed the Ukrainian grain to enter global markets. I have a question to you. What did you expect? We, from the very first days, drew general attention to the fact that the initiative ceases to reflect the initial goal and is becoming clearly commercial in nature. Effectively, from the very beginning, the procurers of food from Ukraine, the gap of procurers of food from Ukraine had developed states enter into this gap. However, there were no steps to reverse this trend. In the time of the work of the Black Sea Initiative, there was approximately 32.8 million tons of goods which were exported, including 70%, which entered high-income and upper-middle-income countries. And as for the poorest countries, specifically Ethiopia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Sudan, and Somalia, they received less than 3%, only 922,092 tons. This geography and commercial significance shows that the humanitarian initiative was a commercial initiative taking into account that the owners of significant amounts of Ukrainian arable land, more than 17 million hectares, were Western corporations, Cargill, DuPont, and Monsanto. And they procured Ukrainian grain after the lifting of Kiev of demand from the IMF demand from Kiev. The 20-year moratorium was lifted for their sale, and they became, those corporations, the beneficiaries of Ukrainian grain export. On the other hand, Ukrainians acquired at dumping costs the Ukrainian food and then reprocessed this product and resell the good with high added value. And they benefit twice from this. And how is this related to providing food to poor countries? Irrelevant in Ukraine. Let's consider the saturation of global food markets and global food security of which should be Russia, not Ukraine. Let's compare the grain production indicators of Russia and Ukraine over the past year. In Ukraine, it's approximately 5 million tons of grains, of which 27 million were exported. And at the same time, as for grain, it's approximately 17 million tons. Russia, 156 million tons of grain was harvested, including 48 million tons of wheat. I would stipulate that exporting what was exported not thanks to the grain deal, but contrary to the obstacles which were laid out. Let us add to the Russian grain production, let us add the fertilizer, and the picture becomes even clearer. Specialists understand everything perfectly well. It is indeed for this reason that the majority, that the main component of the deal was the Russia-UN memorandum on the export of Russian agricultural products. Not a single of its provisions was essentially implemented over the past year. given the historic role of the Russian Federation in terms of leading grain exporters in the world, it is clear that based on the package deal, that we expected exemptions from the discriminatory approach to us by countries in the West to impose unprecedented sanctions against us, effectively attempting to organize a blockade against our producers. This was important, importantly, not in our interest, but rather the interests of countries in need throughout the world. Poor states. The fact that U.S., London, and EU sanctions formally did not apply to food and fertilizer, in fact, had no significance. We are talking about major barriers to our export, the lifting of which, or at least providing working exemptions for, which is something which nobody had any intention of doing. As a result of these barriers, the Russian Federation lost a number of procuring countries whose banking systems were unable to adapt to the new realities, and yet new markets emerged for us where logistical issues were resolved, and this was done by our procurers, unfortunately, without facilitation by the United Nations. The Russia-UN Memorandum of Understanding was intended to help us, and effectively, unfortunately, it did not work. One of our key demands was the re-inclusion of Rossellhozbank, the re-inclusion of this bank into the SWIFT system, which was officially recognized by the EU and US as impossible. One-off transactions with permission from Washington and Brussels cannot ensure continuous transactions and the capability of long-term planning of agricultural provisions and the idea of the establishment of a subsidiary were not carried out. Nobody of those who are claiming that the Russian Federation is starving the world didn't move a finger to ensure free, and I stress this, free of Russian fertilizers under the aegis of the United Nations since the announcement of this purely humanitarian initiative since October of 2022, since September of 2022, of 262,000 tons of products blocked in Latvia, Estonia, Belgium, and Netherlands. Only 2 consignments were delivered with great difficulty, 20,000 tons to Malawi and 34,000 to Kenya. As for the role played by fertilizer in the provision of food security, that significance was already described to us by Mr. Hazin. The import to Russia of spare parts and fertilizer was prohibited as dual-use goods. Our country was, the entire country was announced in a zone of military risks and unaffordable insurance rates. The foreign accounts of domestic agricultural companies were frozen, and the unblocked funds were transferred to the pockets of those same Western representatives via credit repayments and payments for free provisions of and deliveries of our fertilizers. We were patiently awaiting our side of the deal to be complied with. Despite the obstacles related to the Black Sea Initiative, we waited for results for an entire year, and this year saw food and fertilizer exporters in Russia patently operating at a loss. As a result of the loss of the cost of our grain on global markets, 30 to 40% losses for Russian farmers, there was a $1.2 billion loss. And as a result of the situation with cargo and the cost of international transactions, the cost effectiveness halved. The cost for the import of agricultural production and relevant spare parts rose by 40%, and costs for financial transactions rose by 10%, and similar problems are being experienced by our fertilizer producers, where losses now amount to $1.6 billion. Distinguished colleagues, we were long fed with promises about the alleged resumption of the work of the Taliati-Odessa ammonia pipeline for nearly a year in an attempt to wrangle out additional benefits from the Black Sea Initiative. Kiev simply blocked its work, despite the fact that ammonia deliveries were registered under both Istanbul agreements and should have begun concurrently with Ukrainian food exports. I would note that ammonia export for Kiev as well had significant economic benefits, not to mention the humanitarian benefits. Judge for yourselves, every year this pipeline provided deliveries for approximately 2 million tons of raw material for fertilizer, which was sufficient to feed 45 million people. However, on 5 July, the Kiev regime simply torpedoed it, and now we are encountering a situation where global ammonia exports have dropped to 70%. By 70%. And why is it that nobody, including at the United Nations, has raised the alarm about the criminally lost opportunities with far-reaching consequences? The regime of Zelensky in Western Ukraine did not shy away from, contrary to the agreements, capitalizing on the humanitarian corridors to wage attacks targeting military and civilian Russian facilities. And there was also no due assessment of these actions from either the UN or Western countries. And you want us to tolerate this? Distinguished colleagues, I think that given the facts that I have raised, nobody should have been surprised that the decision we took to suspend the Black Sea Initiative after 17 July and the end of the maritime humanitarian corridor as of midnight Moscow time on 20 July 2023. Now all ships, all vessels proceeding to the Black Sea waters in Ukrainian ports are viewed by us as carriers of military cargo. Consequently, the flag states of these vessels will be deemed to be complicit in the Ukrainian conflict on the side of the Kiev regime. Moreover, a number of maritime regions in the northwest and southeast of international waters of the Black Sea will be have been deemed as dangerous for maritime navigation. The relevant information alert on the revocation of security guarantees for seafaring were issued as per standard procedure. Moreover, we would note that in the year of the deal, the Kiev regime has accumulated under its cover significant military industrial huge storage capabilities in its Black Sea ports. There were human resources of the Ukrainian forces and manpower, as well as foreign mercenaries deployed in that area. With the end of the deal, we have an opportunity to address the situation and to ensure that consider the fact that Ukrainian infrastructure is located there as a place of deployment for replenishment of Ukrainian forces with Western weapons. The Russian armed forces have been carried out high-precision sea and air-based strikes as of 19 July targeting multiple attacks, military-industrial facilities, fuel infrastructure, as well as munitions, storage sites of the Ukrainian armed forces in Mykolaiv and Odessa. These targets are being successfully struck. In this connection, we were familiarized with yesterday's reaction of the UN Secretary General to our military action. In this connection, one question, where is it possible to familiarize ourselves with a similar response of Guterres to Kiev's sabotage of the Odessa ammonia pipeline, whose potential for global food security was mentioned today. We attribute to the efforts of the last Secretary General and his team, who sincerely strove to ensure that the pledges made by the West were met, but this was not successful. In order to ensure the breakdown thereof, our Western
Кроме того, мы с вами прекрасно помним, как США, Великобритания и Франция в июле и ноябре прошлого года заблокировали попытку принять какой-либо подход Совета Безопасности с упоминанием меморандума России и ООН. Теперь мы все знаем почему. Меморандум России и ООН они никогда не собираются выполнять, как и Минские соглашения. Беспрекословная реализация Стамбульской договоренности требовала только от нас, и нам же во вред. А сегодня они лукаво пытаются обвинить Россию в срыве
implementation of the Istanbul Agreement is something that was demanded only of us and to our detriment. And now they are deceitfully attempting to accuse the Russian Federation of derailing this deal. And they are attempting to accuse us and blame us for all the misfortune of African and other countries. The states where the West squeezed out all of its juices and resources and plundered its and looted its resources, and resulting in war, hunger, and destitution, and its continuous yesterday under the neocolonialist schemes. Moreover, certain European countries who in words say that Ukraine needs to provide opportunities to export agricultural products themselves are prohibited from importing Ukrainian grain on their territory, talking about the interests of their own producers. In this way, they have stood for two new votes. I wish to stress that we do not object to the deal as such, and especially given its significance for the global food market. For many states, and we stand ready to consider the possibility of rejoining it, but only under one condition. If there is a full taking into account, most important that there be implementation of all previously agreed upon principles of Russia's participation in this agreement. First of all, the real and not theoretical lifting of sanctions on provisions of Russian grain and fertilizers in global markets. Second, there needs to be a lifting of obstacles to Russian bank financial institutions who service food and fertilizer deliveries, including, and this includes the immediate connection to SWIFT. Any new pledges or ideas in this regard are not acceptable because we merely need compliance with these obligations. Third, there needs to be a resumption of deliveries to Russia of spare parts for agriculture and fertilizer production, and the cost of necessary spare parts for our producers on the whole grew by 40%, and the cost of expenditure in financial transactions rose by nearly 10%. And fourth, there needs to be a resolution to all issues of charter vessels, insurance of Russian export, food, deliveries, the cost of charter vessels, and the cost of international financial transactions and other transactions have resulted in a twofold reduction in effectiveness. Fifth, there needs to be the lifting of all obstacles to the provision of Russian fertilizer raw material for their production, including the resumption of the work and operations of the Tolyaty-Odessa ammonia pipeline. Second, Russian assets linked to agricultural production need to be unfrozen. And seven, that is the resumption of the initial humanitarian nature of the countries in need rather than making wealthy countries even wealthier. Distinguished colleagues, as soon as all of these conditions are met, we will immediately rejoin the grain deal, and the implementation of them will represent the contribution of Western states to ensuring international food security. For now, everything that we have heard, everything that we have seen, is merely hypocrisy and demagogy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, dear colleagues, I thank Ecuador and France for the initiative to convene this meeting. I also thank USG Griffith and USG DiCarlo for their updates on the situation on the ground, and Mr. Kazim for his briefing. Brazil has seen with great concern the attacks of recent days against facilities on the Black Sea coast. Destruction of civilian infrastructure is against international humanitarian law and should not be used as a tool by any conflicting part. While deeply regretting the discontinuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, we encourage the parties involved in this particular negotiation process to keep seeking mutually beneficial solutions that can prevent further aggravation of food insecurity in the world. The conflict in Ukraine has caused considerable human suffering not only in the fighting zone, but also in distant regions. Since its beginning, we have warned of its impact on developing countries, which are more vulnerable to rising food, fertilizer, and energy prices. Madam President, throughout the dozens of meetings already held by this Council since the opening of hostilities, we have heard repeated demands for developing countries to take a position on one side of the war. However, those who make these demands do not seem to listen carefully to the positions that have been presented here and elsewhere on the complex causes and worldwide consequences of the conflict. Earlier this week, at the General Assembly debate on the situation of Ukraine, the representative of a member state rightly observed that the voices of the Global South must be heard. Amidst the diversity of views among member states of our organization, there is a message consistently being repeated. It is high time to put an end to war and limit as much as possible its collateral effects. We encourage all parties to resume negotiations on the Black Sea Initiative and urge those parties to refrain from actions that could disrupt the unimpeded flow of food and fertilizers. Brazil expresses its sincere appreciation and support for the mediation efforts of the Secretary General and the government of Turkey, and hopes that the parties will show the necessary flexibility to revive the spirit of the Istanbul agreements. We reiterate our call for the de-escalation of hostilities and the opening of peace negotiations based on respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and recognition of the legitimate security concerns of all. Achieving this goal is our common responsibility under the United Nations Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'd like to start by thanking Under-Secretary General DiCarlo and Under-Secretary General Griffiths for their briefings. My Foreign Secretary said on Monday in this chamber that Russia's termination of the BSGI was taking food out of the mouths of the poorest people across the world. 64% of the 33 million tons of grain exported under the deal went to low and middle-income countries. Unsurprisingly then, Kenya called Russia's withdrawal a stab in the back of countries in the Horn of Africa already impacted by drought. Russian missile attacks on Odessa, Chornomorsk and Mykolaiv destroyed over 60,000 tons of grain. That's enough to feed 270,000 people for a year, or to double WFP shipments under the BSGI to Sudan and Somalia. Russia has destroyed dock equipment, making it harder to load grain on ships. And now Russia has gone further, burning food at the dockside and making threats to murder civilian sailors. There is no possible justification for these punitive acts. Moreover, Russia has benefited from the deal. Russian food exports are significantly above pre-war levels. Russian food and fertilizer exports have never been sanctioned. The UK has worked with its banking and insurance sectors to facilitate transactions, and the UN has worked tirelessly to address Russian concerns. We know that Russia's so-called reasons for ending the deal are nonsense. Ukraine has made no demands. As Foreign Minister Kuleba said in this room, Ukraine wants nothing more than to make its food available to the world. Up to 24 million tons of Ukrainian food may now not reach world markets because of Russia. Russia's actions have already raised prices, with immediate impact on the world's poorest and hungriest people. And Russia's latest demands are tantamount to holding the world starving hostage. We thank Turkey, the UN and Ukraine for their efforts to protect the deal. We call on Russia to rejoin it and to end the war. Food is not a weapon. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council. I thank the Undersecretary General DiCarlo and Undersecretary General Griffiths for their insightful and comprehensive briefings. I would also like to express my particular gratitude to the delegation of Ecuador for personal participation in this meeting of His Excellency Foreign Minister Gustavo Manrique and for his principled statement. I also recognize the representative of the person on the ICC wanted list in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. The first days following the undermining of the Black Sea Grain Initiative have unequivocally testified to the Russian rationale behind this insidious step. Not bothering to fabricate any plausible explanation, Russia has proceeded to the deliberate destruction of Ukrainian capabilities for grain export. Since Monday, the barrage of Russian missile and drone strikes has mainly targeted Ukrainian ports, infrastructure and storage facilities. On 18th till 20th July alone, Russia attacked Ukraine with 56 cruise missiles and 87 Iranian-origin drones. The list of missiles included Caliber, Onyx, Ha-22, Iskander, and Ha-59 missiles. In the port of Chornomorsk alone, Russian strikes destroyed 60,000 tons of grain. For a long time, this cargo was intended to be loaded onto large tonnage vessel. This vessel, however, spent over 60 days in the queue of the grain corridor due to inspections being sabotaged by Russia. The missile attacks also destroyed grain terminals, reservoirs, and berths the ports of Odessa and Chornomorsk. Last night, Russia continued its missile terror, targeting grain warehouses. As a result of the strike by Caliber missiles, 100 tons of peas and 20 tons of barley were destroyed, as reported by Odessa regional authorities. Putin's envoy has tried to invent some arguments about why Russia is so persistent in undermining global food security by destroying Ukrainian grain and other foodstuff. The sly purpose, however, was revealed by Russia itself at the beginning of June at the so-called St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. The head of the infamous Russia Today state propaganda factory, Margarita Simonyan, in the presence of Putin, openly stated, I quote, "All our hope is for the famine." Here is what it means. It means that the famine will start now, and they will lift the sanctions and be friends with us, because they will realize it is necessary. End of quote. In fact, since Russia has already brought to this chamber many oddballs, let me play back the original in Russian.
Presentado ya muchas cosas raras en esta sala. Voy aquí a presentarles el original en ruso.
Right. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. I will give it to you. I will send the original video to you later on. But anyway, as for the intervention of certain self-proclaimed microeconomist, Mr. Hazin, I'd like to refer him to the famous lecture of Professor Harry Frankfurt on humbug. And I quote, He does not reject the authority of the truth, as the liar does. He pays no attention to it at all. by virtue of this, Mr. Hazin's statement is a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. The current actions of Russia only serve to confirm that she was indeed heard. According to expert assessments, further attacks on Ukrainian ports, increased risk to industrial complexes, and the inability to export grains by sea routes will lead to further increase in prices for corn and wheat in the short run. There is also a risk of the suspension of operations at several Ukrainian oilseed processing plants and the reduction in the processing pace of sunflower seeds and rapeseeds, which will significantly impact global prices for sunflower oil. The terror nature of this shelling is aggravated by the fact that such missiles as Onyx and Ha-22 are designed as anti-ship missiles to be launched from the Bastion P ground-based coastal defense system. They have low precision against ground targets. At the same time, it is difficult for Ukrainian air defense to detect and shoot down such missiles as they approach targets at high speed and low altitude. The low accuracy of anti-ship missiles leads to tragedies like that one that occurred on 20th July in Mykolaiv, where a Russian missile hit a residential building, killing a married couple in their apartment and wounding another 19 civilians, including 5 children. Fatalities among civilians were also recorded in Odessa, which sustained heavy missile shelling in recent days. Distinguished colleagues, on July 19, 2023, the Ministry of War of Russia declared that the Russian Federation would attack all merchant vessels in Black Sea waters headed to Ukrainian ports. In fact, the representative of Putin's regime has already repeated the same statement here in today's meetings. Russia's threats to use force against civilian vessels, regardless of their flag, merits strong condemnation. They are an attack on freedom of navigation throughout the world. Russia's intentions to consider foreign vessels as military targets grossly violates its obligations under international law and to all states that conduct peaceful navigation in the Black Sea. According to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, merchant vessels of states not involved in an armed conflict have the right to free and peaceful navigation, which is not considered an act of aggression. Norms of international humanitarian law prohibit any attacks against vessels of neutral states if they do not engage in belligerent acts or do not support military efforts. There is no basis to believe that merchant vessels of foreign nations are supporting military efforts simply by exporting grain to other countries that need it in order to avert the threat of hunger. Russia's action cannot be justified by any norms of international law, including the belligerent's right to blockade. Russia's declaration has no legitimate direct military objective. Instead, it is intended to intimidate neutral states. Russia's declaration covers the entire Black Sea, not just an area immediately around Ukrainian ports, and moreover, does not make exceptions for medical and other humanitarian considerations, as is required by the laws of naval warfare. Madam President, lacking any credible argument to justify what could not be justified, its attacks on the right of people throughout the globe to food,
contra
Russia continues
el derecho
to
a la
cynically
alimentación de
claim
los ciudadanos del
that
mundo
this
y
initiative
sigue
was a
afirmando
commercial
cínicamente que
endeavor,
esta iniciativa
not a humanitarian
tenía
one.
carácter comercial y no
I'm not going to
humanitario.
focus
No me voy a
on
centrar
the moral
en los
aspects of such
aspectos
claims
morales
from a
de
state
estas
that
afirmaciones que vienen
increases
de un Estado
its
que
revenues by
aumenta sus
stealing Ukrainian
ingresos
grain
robando
from the
cereal de
occupied
Ucrania de los
territories,
territorios
which then
ocupados
ends up
que
on the
luego
global markets.
acaba en los mercados mundiales.
At the same time, I will remind the Council
Recuerdo al
of the
Consejo
figures
las cifras
mentioned by the
mencionadas
Secretary
por el
General
secretario
in his
general en
statement
su
of
declaración
17th
del
of
17 de
July.
julio.
The initiative
La
that
iniciativa
ensured the
que
safe
permitió
passage of
el
over
envío
32
seguro de
million
más de
tons of
32
food,
millones de toneladas
commodities
de
from
productos
Ukrainian
básicos
ports
alimentarios de los
and
puertos
helped
de
to reduce
Ucrania
food
y
prices
que
by
ayudó a
over
reducir
23%
los precios
since
de los
March
alimentos
last
en
year.
un 23% desde marzo
The World
del
Food
año
Programme has
pasado.
shipped
El
more than
Programa Mundial de Alimentos ha enviado más de
725,000 tons to support
725.000
humanitarian
toneladas a
operations,
operaciones de
relieving
ayuda
hunger in
humanitaria para
Afghanistan,
luchar
the
contra el
Horn of
hambre en
Africa,
Afganistán, el
and
Cuerno
Yemen.
de África o Yemen.
Russia's withdrawal from the grain
Al
initiative and its
retirarse de la
constant cynical
iniciativa
attacks on
y con sus
Ukrainian
ataques
port
cínicos
infrastructure,
contra
navigation
puertos, medios de navegación
means and grain terminals
y
are
almacenes de
nothing
cereal de
else but
Ucrania,
Russia's
Rusia
attempts to
está
eliminate
intentando
a market
eliminar a un competidor del
deliberately
mercado,
raise world food prices
haciendo que
and
suban
make profit at the
deliberadamente
expense
los
of
precios de
millions
los
of
alimentos
people
y
around the world.
beneficiándose a
We call on our partners
expensas
to
de
fully
millones de
support
personas
Ukraine's
de todo el
initiative
mundo.
to
Pedimos a las
establish a
partes que
humanitarian
apoyen por
maritime
completo
corridor in the
la
Black
iniciativa
Sea.
de Ucrania de crear
The
un corredor
humanitarian
marítimo
corridor will
humanitario en el
restore
Mar Negro.
vital food
Así
supply
se
routes to the
restaurará
regions
una
that need
ruta
them
de
the
suministro de
most.
alimentos fundamental a las
We
regiones
call on
que
the
más lo
international
necesitan.
community to
Pedimos a la
condemn
comunidad
Russia's actions
internacional que
and
condene
take
las acciones
appropriate
de
measures
Rusia y
to
tome las
ensure
medidas
the
adecuadas
safety
para
of navigation
garantizar
in the
la
Black
seguridad
Sea
de la
as a
navegación en
guarantee
el
of
Mar
food
Negro,
security around the
para
world.
garantizar a su vez la seguridad
In the
alimentaria
words
en
of
el
my
mundo entero.
president,
En palabras de mi
Russian terrorists
presidente, los
want to become
terroristas
exemplary
rusos quieren
in the way they
convertirse
destroy
en
life.
ejemplares en cuanto a
We
cómo
will
destruyen
become
la vida.
exemplary in the way
Nosotros
we
seremos
protect life
ejemplares
and in the
por
way
proteger
life
la
then
vida
responds
y
justly
luego veremos
and
que la vida
inevitably
responderá de
to
forma
every blow
justa e
inflicted
inevitable
on every
a
terrorist.
todos los ataques infligidos a
Before
todos
I
los
end,
terroristas.
I would like to use this
Antes de
opportunity
terminar, aprovecho esta
to make a
ocasión
formal request to the
para pedir
representatives of the
oficialmente
Secretary
a
General
los representantes del
present in
secretario
this
general
chamber.
presentes en esta sala
I ask them to draw the attention
señalen
of the
a la
relevant UN
atención
officials,
de los diferentes
in
funcionarios de las
particular
Naciones
the
Unidas,
special
en
representative
especial el
of the Secretary
representante
General
especial del
on
secretario
children
general
and armed
sobre
conflict,
niños y conflictos armados,
to the public confession
la confesión
of the
pública
officials of the
de
Belarusian National Red
miembros
Cross Committee,
del Comité Nacional de la Cruz Roja
where
de
they admit
Belarus,
to their involvement
que han
in
admitido
the illegal
estar implicados
mass forceful removal of children
el
from the
secuestro
occupied
ilegal y
territories
por la
of
fuerza
Ukraine.
de niños de los territorios
I also
ilegalmente
ask them
ocupados de
to
Ucrania.
properly monitor
Y
and
les pido
report
también que sigan
on
de
this
cerca la cuestión
shocking
y
situation. And I thank you.
presenten informes.
I thank the representative
Gracias.
of Ukraine for their
Gracias a
statement,
Ucrania
and
por
I
su
now give the floor
declaración,
to
y
the
ahora tiene la
representative of
palabra
Turkey.
Turquía.
Thank you, Madam President.
Gracias, señora
we thank you for
presidenta.
organizing this
Gracias
meeting,
por convocar la
and we
reunión.
also thank Undersecretary General
Gracias también
Griffiths and Undersecretary General
al secretario
DiCarlo
general
for their
adjunto Griffiths
briefings.
y a la secretaria general adjunta
In addition to
DiCarlo.
the loss of thousands of
Además de
civilian
la
lives,
pérdida de cientos de
millions of
miles
displaced
de
people, and the
civiles,
billions
los
of
millones de
dollars of
desplazados, los
material
miles de
damage,
millones de
the ongoing war in
dólares en
Ukraine
daños
also
materiales, la
continues to
guerra
have
en
negative
Ucrania sigue teniendo
repercussions
consecuencias
on energy
negativas
prices,
sobre los
supply
precios de la
chain
energía,
disruptions,
las
and
cadenas de
global food
suministro
insecurity.
y afecta
The
también a
Black
la
Sea Grain Initiative has
seguridad
had a
mundial de los alimentos. La
stabilizing
iniciativa del Mar
effect
Negro
on the prices of
había
grain
estabilizado
and
el precio
contributed
del
to
cereal
global
y
food
contribuido
security for
a la
almost 1
seguridad
year.
de alimentos para
This
prácticamente
initiative
todo
has
el mundo
allowed
desde hace un
more
año.
than
Con esta
32.8
iniciativa, más de
million tons of various
32,8
grain
millones de
products
toneladas de
to reach the
diferentes
world markets
cereales se
since
habían
August
distribuido
en los mercados del mundo desde agosto de 2022. Con esto
conseguimos evitar escasez de alimentos y ayudar a los países de ingresos bajos a acceder a productos alimentarios. El Programa Mundial de Alimentos también pudo aprovechar la reducción de los precios para su funcionamiento. Por tanto, la reanudación de la Iniciativa del Mar Negro sigue siendo fundamental. Es uno de nuestros objetivos comunes para erradicar el hambre del mundo y conseguir unos precios estables para los consumidores de todo el planeta. La retirada permanente de la Iniciativa del Mar Negro va a ser perjudicial para todos los mercados. Los países que dependen de la estabilidad de los precios que da la iniciativa son los que más van a sufrir.
Both the Black Sea Initiative and the Memorandum of Understanding between the UN and the Russian Federation are crucial for the vulnerable people around the world. This is why we need to combine our efforts and find a way to implement the two components of the deal simultaneously. To this end, we commend the efforts of the Secretary General for the facilitation of the export of Russian food and fertilizer products. We recognize that there is still room for improvement. This also requires further steps from all relevant stakeholders. We must be mindful that the world's most vulnerable communities depend on a compromise we would devise to revive the initiative. We hope that the current suspension will be temporary and the operations will be resumed as soon as possible by addressing the needs and expectations of all stakeholders. We will continue our efforts in coordination with the UN and the two sides. In the meantime, we urge all sides to remain calm, exercise restraint, and avoid taking any unilateral steps that might jeopardize prospects for the resumption of the initiative.
La reanudación de la iniciativa. Gracias a la representante de Turquía por su intervención y ahora tiene la palabra Rumanía.
Thank you, Madam President. And I would like to thank France and Ecuador for calling this meeting, USG DiCarlo and USG Griffiths for their briefings, as well as the UK Presidency for allowing my delegation to take the floor. Yesterday, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres spoke about trust, solidarity, and universality when launching his policy brief on the new agenda for peace. In his policy brief, he also mentions that the war is a choice. A year and a half since its invasion of Ukraine, Russia still wages a war of choice. In a similar and defiant way to the needs of developing countries, Russia's decision to denounce BSGI is a matter of choice. But Russia's decision has multidimensional effects around the world. We are yet to anticipate them. But we will stand in solidarity with those in need. Romania joins previous speakers in commending the efforts of the UN and others, in particular to Kiev, to be constructive and alleviate the tensions on the food market. We also call on Russia to reconsider its decision and make the right choice in returning to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. BSGI remains a good example of multilateralism at work, but all players need to be constructive and abide by the rules, the UN Charter, international law, international humanitarian law. Out of the 41 million grains from Ukraine that were exported through the EU solidarity lanes, over 20 million transited Romania. Together with the 32 million tons of grains via BSGI, the total amount that left from the Black Sea shores to the world is over 50 million grains. This means choice to uphold trust, solidarity, and universality. My country will continue to uphold its promise to the world and to make its own contribution in mitigating the risks of food global crisis, both in national capacity as a direct neighbor to Ukraine and as member of the European Union. Together with the UN, the European Union did everything in its power to deal with the challenges posed by an actor that undermined international law. A pragmatical choice was favored, one that made all efforts so that developing countries could benefit from BSGI and the grains exported through it. BSGI is a win for all those participating in it and for all those benefiting from it. BSGI is a clear expression of leave no one behind. Its restoration is imperative. Madam President, we continue to be appalled by the high number of attacks targeting schools and hospitals in Ukraine, again and again. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are strictly prohibited under international law and must cease immediately. This includes the ongoing strikes with missiles and drones on the Ukraine's ports of Odessa, Chornomorsk, and Mykolaiv. Upholding international law and UN Charter principles is paramount. Otherwise, we become accessory to impunity. It is not how we want to project the future of incoming generations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Romania for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, the Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and thank you to the Undersecretary General DiCarlo and Griffiths for their briefings and for your relentless efforts under the leadership of the Secretary General over the last year or so. Madam President, a permanent member of the Security Council is threatening to attack any ship, regardless of its cargo or its flag, that enters part of the Black Sea. So now we're all potential targets of the Russian aggression. It is bombing grain, warehouses and infrastructure in Ukrainian ports, key to food security globally. And it has torpedoed the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And yet it claims to care about global food security. Madam President, the EU condemns Russia's choice to terminate the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It further aggravates the global food crisis and it causes price increases for foodstuff globally. Hundreds of millions of already vulnerable people, in particular in Africa, will pay the price. We commend the efforts of the United Nations and Turkey to continue engaging in a constructive dialogue, and we call on Russia to reconsider its withdrawal. Any arrangements have to include Ukraine. Since withdrawing, Russia has bombed port infrastructure, as we've heard, in Odessa, Chornomorsk and Mykolaiv, causing civilian casualties, including children. According to reports, more than 60,000 tons of grain destined for exports were destroyed on Wednesday. Russia has threatened to attack grain shipments passing through the Black Sea. This is completely unacceptable. The inconvenient truth that Russia wishes to hide is that it is benefiting from higher global food prices. Publicly available data demonstrate that Russian grain exports have reached record volumes. From 1st of July 2022 to 30th of June 2023, Russia's wheat exports reached 44.7 million tons, more than 10% higher than the average previous years. Its fertilizer exports are nearing full recovery. In contrary to claims by Russian disinformation, the Black Sea Grain Initiative benefited all food importing countries by contributing to lower global prices. The export of almost 33 million tons of grains and foodstuffs from Ukraine to 45 different countries reduced prices by over 23% since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Half of the grain, including 2/3 of the wheat, went to developing countries. Half of the total World Food Programme grain procurement in support of its humanitarian operations in the most food-insecure countries comes from Ukraine. Without the Black Sea route, the WFP will have to source its assistance elsewhere at a higher cost. The Black Sea Grain Initiative is a major deliverable of effective multilateralism and, in the words of the Secretary General, a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needs it. Since Russia's withdrawal, prices on wheat and corn, as we've heard this morning, have surged. The simple truth is that Russia has made a cynical calculation. By blocking exports from Ukraine, it will make higher profits from its own exports. The Secretary General clearly demonstrated that Russia gained important benefits from the Memorandum of Understanding of Food and Fertilizer Exports. The UN has worked relentlessly to unblock assets, facilitate regulatory frameworks and engage with the private sector to find dedicated solutions across banking and insurance sectors. These efforts were conducted in close collaboration with the EU. While Russia spreads disinformation and maintains its own export restrictions on food and fertilizer to drive up prices, the EU has spared no effort to avoid that our sanctions impact the food security of third countries. We provided extensive guidance to economic operators on the implementation of sanctions, clarifying that transfer of Russian food and fertilizers to third countries by EU operators and our territory is permitted. We introduced a legislative derogation in December authorizing transactions with sanctioned individuals to facilitate such trade. We worked with the UN to build a bespoke payments mechanism mechanism for the Russian Agriculture Bank through JP Morgan outside of SWIFT to allow food and fertilizer-related payments, and we are working closely with the UN and partners to address any specific bottlenecks and facilitate the access of food and fertilizers originating from Russia. Russia knows all this. The EU and its member states remain committed to address the needs of countries vulnerable to food insecurity. The Food Systems Summit in Rome next week will call for accelerated action in this regard. In addition to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the EU solidarity lanes have allowed the export of more than 41 million tons of Ukraine's food and agricultural goods. We're also providing 18 billion euros to address food security needs, focusing on the most vulnerable regions, and we reiterate our call on all countries to step up their own humanitarian assistance in this regard. Madam President, we call on Russia to stop using food as a weapon and rejoin the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The EU will continue to act to fight food insecurity. Food cannot be used as a political tool. We remain open to explore solutions with the United Nations that will contribute to the resumption of the grain deal. In closing, I remind the Council that the Black Sea Grain Initiative would not have been necessary if Russia had not waged a war of aggression against its neighbor and blocked Ukrainian ports for exporting grain. And I reiterate the EU's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders and its inherent right to self-defense. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skoog for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.